Let me know when we're live. Testing, testing. Yeah? All right. I don't think I'm on. All right, test, test. There we go. Welcome, everyone, to our live debate on graduated income tax. We are so pleased to be able to provide this to the community. My name is Claire Slattery. I'm the executive director of our Lake Zurich Area Chamber of Commerce. And what a world we're in. We have a small live audience and so many great people that have registered online to be watching it with us today, including Senator Dan McConkey. So everyone, hello. Our past president, Ms. Ginny Opsel with Remax at Home. I could go to everyone, but I'm going to do one more, and then that's it. And our past president, Miss Bonnie Conti with Avalon Salon and Day Spa. And, of course, there are other much appreciated people in the room, just as there are appreciated people on our call or on our live stream. I want to give a big shout-out to the Knights of Columbus. We are here in Columbus Banquet Center. And also Simply Delicious Catering, Mr. Rich Hernandez, who helped us secure the space for today. It's a lovely banquet center, so once we get back to events, hopefully everyone can check this out. I also want to give a really big shout out to John. John waved to us in the back, so we all see you. Yes.
Hi, John.
An unbelievable setup this guy has. It's so great. He's very meticulous. If you're ever wanting to do this live stream type of thing, please inquire with John because he's amazing. So, and then also we have Pete Salerno, who is on our board. Pete, yep, and Pete has been helping us with all the technical aspects and tech support, and he's assisting John back there today. I'd also like to give a shout out to our moderator today, and really thanks to our Government Affairs Committee. I know several of our Government Affairs Committee members are on the live stream right now, but thank you to the group as a whole. Miss Lynn is here for helping us coordinate this and securing these great speakers today. And again, thank you to our moderator for today, Miss Amanda Howland. She's on our board of directors and she helps chair the Government Affairs Committee. I wanted to just take a quick second to say that our chamber, our Lake Zurich Area Chamber of Commerce, we have 5 villages that we represent. Lake Zurich, Killdeer, Long Grove, Hawthorne Woods, and Deer Park. And again, 25% of our membership comes from outside of those areas. So we're really broad and diverse in terms of the local businesses that we represent. And we represent over 400 businesses. So in this time and day, you know, we just want to make sure that we're supporting our members as best that we can. I encourage you to visit our website at lzacc.com and find out ways that you can support those businesses. For instance, right now we have a bingo, a shop local bingo going. So try and help us support those members. And if you know members that are in need of assistance during this time, whether it's loans or PPP equipment, have them contact our chamber so that we can help. Our goal today is to educate our community, right? So I remind our speakers about that too, because as much as we want to see some good, we're going to go through our pros, we're going to go through our cons, and what I'd like to say for everyone in the audience, as well as everyone online, if you have questions, the way questions are working today, regardless of if you're in or online, is that you're going to go to our website at lzacc.com. There is a slider there that comes up that has this event on it. Or you can go straight to this website, lzacc.com/graduated-tax-debate. And there will be there your live stream of what we're looking like right now, and also the box to prompt questions. This is what Amanda's going to use to run through the Q&A as soon as we're done with all the presentations. So we are going to give each of our speakers roughly 10 minutes, no more than 10 minutes. I'll be signaling from the back. And we're going to, just go ahead and give each speaker that time, and then we'll go right into the Q&A. So if you have questions at any time during their presentation, then enter those in. And that way they can be discussed or brought up during Q&A. So at this time, I'm going to bring Dan Biss up. Can you hand me the... Yes, this is not your water. There you go.
You'll have to bear with me taking off my mask as well. This is the best part of my presentation by far.
You're not the one who's running the media, so.
A man who's at home in a classroom. There you go.
No problem. While we're doing this, I just want to first of all thank the organizers. Really, it means a lot that y'all are willing to come out in this time and put together this conversation. My name's Daniel Biss. I was asked to introduce myself, which is always a dangerous thing to ask a politician to do. I was a state legislator for 8 years, representing North Suburban Cook County, both in the House and the Senate. And I'll say I ran for governor in 2018. I lost the Democratic primary, as you would guess, since somebody else is governor. But if I had to say one reason why I ran for governor, I ran because I thought this question, the one before us in this referendum of would we change the Constitution to allow a fair tax, was the most important one for the state of Illinois. It was the one that I thought would answer the question of whether my kids will be able to one day live in a fiscally healthy, thriving state of Illinois. And I ran to put that issue on the agenda, and there's no better way to lose an election than to lose to a guy who does the thing that you were hoping to do yourself had you won. So it's, any of you who are hoping to lose elections in the future, I would recommend you do it that way. It was a surprisingly gratifying way to do it. Oh, and here we are. So I'm going to start my little self-timer here. I have a slide there, and there are going to be one or maybe two more slides, but I'm not going to go through a ton of statistics and details. I want to just talk about a really basic question, which is why does this proposed change to the Illinois Constitution matter so much? What's it really about at its core? And I think respectfully that's an important question for us to focus on today. We're going to hear a lot of conversation, I would imagine, about a lot of different issues. We're going to hear about pensions and the scope and function of state government, and we're going to hear about probably public when you go to the polls in November or October of this year. The issue you're going to be asked to vote on is one simple, narrow question, which is, should the Illinois Constitution say that we have no choice but to ask everybody in the state to pay the exact same income tax rate, or should instead the Illinois Constitution say, hey, guess what? When you vote for a candidate for state rep or state senator, they ought to have the right to promise you to change the tax code based upon what you think it ought to be. When Dan McConkey runs for re-election for state senate, should he have the right to say, hey, let's lower this tax bracket here but not that one there? Or should he be forced by the Constitution to say, I can't do that. I can't help you out, what people who oppose the fair tax say? This chart answers that question. So now let's walk through this chart for a second. This chart shows how much of your income you're paying in total state and local tax. And I want to be clear about this. This is all in. This is not just the income tax, it's not just state taxes, it's what you're paying to your school district, it's what you're paying in fees, it's what you're paying to your county, it's what you're paying to every state and local government body as a percentage of your income. And what does it show? If you're on the left-hand side of this chart, the leftmost bar, that's the bottom fifth, the poorest 20% of households in the state of Illinois. What are they paying in tax? They're paying between 14 and 15% of their income in tax, right? If you're making 25 grand a year, 20 grand a year, and you're in this category, almost 15% of what you make, you're paying either to your school district or your state or somebody else in tax. And what you see as you march across this graph from left to right, from less affluent to more affluent, people are paying less and less until you get to the top 1%, and folks in that top 1% are paying 7.5. They're paying under 7.5. So just to reiterate, if you're in the very bottom in Illinois, you're paying 15. If you're at the very top, you're paying 7. If you are at the top, you're paying half the tax rate of what people at the bottom are paying. That's today. That's right now. And look, I get it. I'm a Democrat. I'm a progressive. I believe in all kinds of things that are controversial. And again, on a different occasion, I'd love to argue about each of those. But my friends, the idea that this is rotten is not controversial. Everybody in this state, if you stop them on the street and say, hey, hold on, work with me here. Should the poor pay double the rich? Everybody in the state, Democrats, Republicans, independents, conservatives, liberals, everybody, they would say, no, that does not make sense. That's not right. So the question you might ask is, if our income tax is flat, if everybody's paying the same income tax rate, shouldn't this be flat? Shouldn't everybody be paying the same percentage if that's what the income tax code says? And the answer is no, because we're paying a lot of other taxes. And I want to talk about the two biggest other taxes that we pay in Illinois. And let's start with the one that probably annoys you the most. It definitely annoys me the most. That would be the property tax. Our property taxes are very high in Illinois. And they're not just very high, they're distributed in a way that leads straight to this chart. Now let's think for a second about why that is. How do we get there? Well, it's just common sense. And by the way, though, there's a ton wrong with the property tax in Illinois specifically. What I'm about to say isn't really about Illinois. It's just about how property taxes work. Property taxes are effectively, they're pretty much a tax on housing. Whether you own your home and you're directly paying the property tax on the value of the house that you own, or whether you rent and you're indirectly paying because your rent is higher because your landlord is paying a high property tax. A property tax is a tax on your housing costs. Well, who pays a greater share of their income in housing costs? The poor and the middle class. Middle class homeowners pay a ton of their income in mortgage typically. The value of their home is a very, very significant part of their finances. The wealthier you are, what tends to happen is the less significant your housing costs are as a share of your income, and therefore it is inevitable that a property tax, which is a tax on housing costs, impacts the poor and the middle class more than the wealthy. This work. So what's the next tax that we ought to talk about? Sales tax. It's the same phenomenon. It's the same phenomenon. If you look at someone who is living paycheck to paycheck, if you look at a middle class family, if you look at someone whose finances are relatively precarious and they find a way to get a $500 or $1,000 raise, where does that money get spent? It gets spent usually in that year, often in the neighborhood where the person lives, and is therefore assessed a sales tax. People who are more affluent, have different life circumstances, are less likely to spend that next marginal dollar they make in a given year on something in the state of Illinois that is subject to sales tax. And so once again, a chart like this, if you were to ask how much of people's incomes are they paying in sales tax, it would look just like this. It would say, listen, the wealthier you are, the easier, the lighter a burden the sales tax is on your financial situation. The poorer you are, the greater the burden. And so this chart is what you get from property taxes. This chart is what you get from income taxes and what almost every other, from sales taxes. And so what almost every other state has decided is to counterbalance this nightmare, to even things out, to create some tax fairness. Let's say that while we're overburdening the poor and the middle class compared to the wealthy with the property tax and the sales tax, let's do the opposite with the income tax. Let's give the middle class a break. Let's give the poor a break. Let's ask the wealthier to pay a little bit more to just even the playing field a little bit. Wisconsin does that. Iowa does that. Missouri does that. Kentucky does that. Indiana doesn't do that, but they could. It's allowable under their constitution. And dozens of other states do it as well. Illinois cannot. We are prohibited from saying, let's just level the playing field. Let's use the only tool at our disposal, the only way that states can bring in revenue that gives the middle class a break, that gives struggling small business owners a break, that gives the poor a break. Let's use that to level the playing field and bring in revenue in a way that is equal across society. That's not allowable today. And because of that, we've had our hands tied behind our back as we've tried to address our fiscal problems for the last 50 years since this Constitution got written in 1970. This November and October, we have an opportunity to vote yes for the fair tax, remove those manacles, and allow ourselves to have a tax system like our neighboring states, like almost all other states, like the federal government, like what almost everybody, Democrat, Republican, Independent, Conservative, Liberal, would say if you just asked them, what does fair look like? That's why voting yes on this is so important. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Daniel. I appreciate your comments and your slide. And we will now bring up Ralph.
Scary part is when
You're all sanitized.
And which one moves them forward?
the bigger button.
The giant green one? Yeah, I'm blind as a bat. All right, Ralph Martiri, a little introduction on me. I'm Executive Director of the Bipartisan Center for Tax and Budget Accountability, and we take the bipartisan pretty seriously. We annoy electeds in both parties, and we work with elected in both parties. I've been appointed to a federal commission on educational excellence and equity by President Obama, and Governor Rauner appointed me to his Human Rights Commission and to his professional review panel looking at the state school funding formula. We work with Democrats and Republicans. We make occasional issues for Democrats and Republicans. We try to follow best practices. Number two, I'm actually the Rubloff Professor of Public Policy at Roosevelt University, and I teach, among other things, a master's course on tax and fiscal policy. And I really appreciate you inviting me here. If you think about it, I teach a course on tax policy. I talk about why tax policy is good. That's not quite as popular as it may seem. Fiscal year 2021 budget. What you see in the budget is we're going to spend $42 billion. Go to the top line, right? That's the general fund budget for the year. We break it into its two component parts. There are hard costs. These are things the state has to pay either by law or by contract. There's no discretion. The money comes in, the money comes out. So of that $42 billion, $14 billion is going to be spent on debt service, pension contributions, other required statutory transfers out, and group health insurance for state workers. Obligation. Money comes in, money comes out. Then here's the discretionary part of the budget, the second part where they spend on services. And what you could see is 96% of the expenditures on services in the state of Illinois go to four things. Education writ large, that includes early childhood, higher ed, and K-12. Healthcare, human services, and public safety. That's what the state spends its money on. That's what the state has historically spent its money on. If you analyze the general fund of every state in America, that's what they spend their money on. This is what state governments spend on. All right. How big is our fiscal hole in Illinois? Everyone knows we have a problem with the deficit. Not everyone knows the amount of the deficit. Well, we thought we'd let you know. So starting point, we have projected to have $42 billion in revenue for this year. That's the top line, right? And then second line is the hard costs we have to pay by law. Take that out of your revenue, have to pay it by law. Take it out, that leaves $28 billion in revenue. We're going to spend $28 billion on services. Sounds like we have a balanced budget, but we do not. Why? There's $8.4 billion of past due bills left over from fiscal year 20 that are going to have to be paid in fiscal year 21. And by law, they become a charge on your current revenue. So you got to take that out as well, leaving a balance of $19 billion in revenue. We're going to spend 28 on services, meaning the deficit in unpaid bills anyway, the deficit spending, remains at just about $8.4 billion. However, it's much worse than that. Because in that revenue figure, there's included a $5 billion loan from the federal government this year that we're getting as part of the relief package. Well, that's not recurring revenue. It's not there next year. It's supporting $5 billion of expenditures this year. It's got to be repaid in the next couple of years, meaning next year starts with a hole of over $13 billion. So if the state of Illinois wanted to provide the exact same level of public services in the next fiscal year as it intends to provide this year, it's starting off without 47% of the revenue needed to do that. That is a big hole. How did we get there? That's an important question. We have a structural deficit. Now, nothing else I'm going to provide you includes modeling, because anyone here does statistics for a living? Anyone? If you do statistics, what you know is your model can dance to any tune you want to make it dance to based on your assumptions. You can play games with a model. So we stay away from modeling at CTBA. What we try to do is what we call math, publicly available data sets that you could run the numbers on yourself. However, when you're projecting forward, you have to have a model to see whether or not your revenue will grow with your cost growth as anticipated under current law. This model's been peer-reviewed by 4 different PhD economists, and we've been using it since the middle 2000s, like 2003 or 4. We've actually accurately predicted the growth in the state's deficit within 1% every year using this model. If we started with a balanced budget in 2019, the yellow line shows you the anticipated inflationary growth in providing the same level of services we did in 2019 in the future, not adding or increasing a 1, just doing that in tomorrow what we did then, and paying our debt. There's no adjustment for that. And the red line shows you what our revenue will do. The gap between revenue growth and cost growth is the structural deficit. We've had one of these in Illinois. University of Illinois first identified one for our state in the early 70s. So for generations, our revenue hasn't been sufficient to maintain our service levels. The only ways to solve this is to cut your service levels down to your revenue permanently or raise your revenue up to your service cost level. Neither of those are politically popular options. For some reason, cutting education, health, social services, and public safety isn't something most elected officials want to do every year. Raising taxes, apparently, is problematic in a political process. Who knew? But it is. Apparently, tax is one of 2 3-letter words ending in X in the English language that gets folks all excited. So what we've opted to do in the state of Illinois, 2 things. Hide the structural deficit from voters by shifting the cost for public education away from the state and down to local property taxes. You want to know why your property taxes are high? It's because the state of Illinois doesn't pay its fair share from state-based revenue. In fact, the property tax is the only tax where we are an outlier in having too high of a tax burden in the nation. It's outrageous. Dan was completely right when he said that. The second thing they did, they said, hey, we have this obligation to fund our public employee pensions. Let's just not do that. Let's instead write an IOU to the pension systems that we could pay back someday, with interest that compounds, by the way, and take the money that should have gone to the pension system and use it to hide this gap and fund public services. So that's not taxing to spend, that's borrowing to spend. Pretty irresponsible. Did outrageous spending lead to that structural deficit? Is spending what needs to be brought in? This compares our state spending in the fiscal year 2000 to the fiscal year 2021, a 20-year period, 21-year period, adjusted for inflation. Go to the bottom line. We're spending 20% less after inflation on education, health, social services, and public safety today than we did in the year 2000 under Governor Ryan. Revenue. This is all inflation-adjusted current dollars. So in 2000, we had more general fund revenue than we do today on an inflation-adjusted basis. Why that's eye-opening? Our income tax rate was 3% for individuals then, and for corporations it was 4.8%. Those respective rates are 4.95 and 7% today. So despite the increases in rates, our revenue growth hasn't kept up with the economy. Something's wrong with the tax system. So Dan hinted at this. When you put together a tax system, different taxes play different roles. It's like putting together an investment portfolio. So your property taxes, your sales taxes, those things are supposed to be somewhat stable revenue sources over time. They're not particularly fair. They create an unfair tax burden, but they're relatively stable. The tax that's supposed to respond to your economy and the tax that is supposed to create vertical tax fairness among taxpayers is the income tax. It is the only tax that could be designed to comport with ability to pay. Every other tax and fee available to government is regressive and has to take more from a low or moderate income family's earnings than from an affluent family's. So the only way to balance that in your tax policy is to have a graduated rate structure for your income tax, which our Constitution doesn't allow. So we are constitutionally prohibited from actually utilizing one of the basic tools of fiscal policy you're supposed to utilize when designing a tax system to work, and ours does not. This is the pension ramp. So you add those lines together, and that's the total payment required for covering our debt to the pension systems. I broke the payment into the two parts to show you how aggressively we borrowed against the pensions and how aggressively we backloaded the payments. Those pink lines at the bottom, that's the normal cost of funding benefits to workers. The blue bar, that's the responsible plan for repaying the debt. Does it look pretty responsible to you? Let me tell you how goofy it is. This year, the growth in the debt service was over $500 million on a year-to-year basis. Our total revenue growth in the general fund was $180 million. 3 times our revenue growth. It's so backloaded that it just can't be done. And here's the property tax burden in Illinois for funding schools compared to the rest of the nation. Go to the far left. In Illinois, 67% of the cost of education is paid for property taxes. On average, it's only 44%. Flip that, the state only covers 24% of the cost of education from state taxes. The national average is 47%. You want property taxes to come down? We got to eliminate that structural deficit and get the state to fund education adequately, which right now, we underfund education at the state level by $7 billion. That's the governor's numbers, Governor Rauner's included. All right. So a lot of people are opposed to the fair tax or graduated rate structure as somehow anti-business or anti-capitalist. It is not. In fact, Adam Smith, the guy that invented capitalism, said, quote unquote, taxes should be designed, go down to here, to remedy inequality of riches as much as possible by relieving the poor and burdening the rich. Why did he say that? He thought income growth in the economy he was designing would always disproportionately go to top income classes over everyone else. Not evil or immoral, but how it works. And it's how it worked. This is income in Illinois, adjusted for inflation from 1979. The far left, the wealthiest 1% in our state saw their incomes grow by 254% after inflation over this period, jumping from $400,000 a year to $1.4 million. The bottom 99% saw their incomes grow by 20%, from $51,000 on average to $61,000. If I had the bottom 90%, it would be negative. So the only way to respond to that is to have a graduated rate structure for your income tax. It's the only way. Otherwise, you're going to overtax the people at the bottom and the middle, and you're going to undertax the people at the top, just like what we do. And by not responding to the economy, you have a structural deficit. When you have a structural deficit, you encourage elected officials to do irresponsible things like borrowing to spend and deferring costs to property taxes. I have a lot more, but I'll get off the stage.
Thank you for all that information. Those slides are very informative. I hope people take a look at them. And we will now hear from the other side, other point of view, as to why we should not have a graduated income tax, so that you can weigh, and after we're finished with both of our next speakers, we'll be taking questions. So thank you. This is all nice and clean for you now.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I can't tell you how delighted I am to be here today. My name is Andrew Nelms, and I work with an organization called Americans for Prosperity Action. And I feel very much at home here as a proud third-degree member of the Knights of Columbus and past Grand Knight of my college council. I'm very thankful to our hosts and also to the Chamber of Commerce, a wonderful organization, for having us here today. And I was a last-minute substitution in full disclosure, and after hearing from all of these erudite gentlemen, you'll understand that I'm certainly bringing up the intellectual rear, but nevertheless, here we go. Now, the proponents of the graduated income tax speak of upgrading our old tax system and modernizing the tax code, but there's nothing new under the sun, as we know, and the notion of a flat or proportional or a graduated or progressive tax is a proportion of their income. You are at sea without rudder or compass, and there is no amount of injustice or folly you may commit. The famed British economist John Stuart Mill referred to it as a mild form of robbery. And with all due respect to Professor Martire, the quote from An Inquiry into the Causes and Nature of the Wealth of Nations is actually a footnote from a gentleman named Henry Home, and the reason that Adam Smith was quoting it was because of Home's position on smuggling, for instance. In the section on taxes, Adam Smith talks about proportionality, certainty and predictability, and then he quotes Lord Keynes. But nevertheless, a report prepared by Moody's Analytics at the request of the state, released earlier this year, stated, quote, "The vibrant national economy is enticing more of the state's residents to seek opportunities elsewhere. The main reason for the worsening trend is a loss of domestic residents or people moving from Illinois to other parts of the United States. And in the past few years, the gap has widened as an underperforming Illinois economy has reduced the state's appeal compared with the rest of the country." Now, that sobering analysis was released prior to the pandemic. Recently, the State Chamber of Commerce released a report which cautioned that the tax hike would be even more harmful. It said that, quote, "Rather than eliminate jobs from a relatively strong economy that might have been capable of quickly replacing them, the proposed graduated income tax will now..." Illinois has been dubbed the worst state to be a taxpayer, and we have the highest combined state and local tax burden in the nation, as was highlighted. And as I always say, Illinois is at the top of every list we ought to be at the bottom of, and we're at the bottom of every list we ought to be at top. But in fact, if you look at the state income tax, the slide that Dr. Biss put up was the total state and local taxes paid. If you look at just the state income tax, it actually is progressive because of the way that it's been structured, where the bottom 20% pay 1.5% of their income towards the state income tax, and the top 1% pay 4%, a little over 4% towards the state income tax. Now, we all know the wonderful things that Illinois has going for it. We're the 6th most populous state after forfeiting the title of 5th most populous state to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania a few years ago. We've been blessed with abundant natural resources. You know, it's hard to believe here in Lake Zurich, but 75% of Illinois is covered by farmland. Our industrious farmers feed the world, and 36 Fortune 500 companies are headquartered here, down by one since 2014 when OfficeMax decided to relocate to Boca Raton, Florida. And if Illinois were a standalone country, our economy would be among the top 20 on the globe. And yet, we find ourselves in this predicament. Now, fundamentally, when Illinoisans consider this question, fundamentally, they need to consider whether or not they believe that Illinois politicians possess the fiscal discipline to enact a graduated income tax in such a way that it won't prove to be a bad deal for middle-class families. We had a balanced budget but once this century. And if you've been following current events, some of these headlines may sound familiar. FBI agents conduct raid at Illinois Capitol. Illinois State Representative charged with offering bribe. Former Illinois State Senator pleads guilty to federal bribery. Of course, we all know about the unpleasantness regarding ComEd and their $200 million fine. And of course, here in Lake County, you know all too well that one of your legislators was charged with a felony recently, which triggered his resignation from the Legislative Ethics Commission. For heaven's sake, after Rod's recent homecoming, we as Illinoisans were without a former governor in federal prison for the first time in over a dozen years. So do you trust Springfield politicians with more tax power? Now, of course, there are two ways to raise tax revenue. You can either raise the tax rates, as has been done in the past, and as folks wish to do now, or you could expand the total amount of taxable income by correcting the problems identified by Moody's in that recent report by making Illinois a more attractive place to live and work and raise a family. Now, as long as Illinois has had an income tax, which has only been for 25% of our time as a state, it's been flat. In fact, the promise of a flat income tax is enshrined in Article 9, Section 3 of the state constitution, which states quite simply that a tax on or measured by income shall be at a non-graduated rate, full stop. And so this entire debate that we'll see maybe $100 million spent on is over those few words in the state constitution. Now, to levy higher taxes. And we can look at how taxpayers have been treated by our politicians in the past. Keep in mind that votes to increase the rates require a simple majority. In 2011, the so-called temporary income tax, that vote occurred on the last night of a lame duck session. In fact, 20% of the votes for that tax hike came from lame duck lawmakers who were no longer accountable to the voters. In 2017, the vote to permanently increase the income tax occurred over the Independence Day weekend, while you and other Illinoisans were enjoying fireworks and backyard barbecues. And just last year, the legislature doubled the gasoline tax as part of a last-minute negotiation in overtime. Now, beleaguered Illinois taxpayers forfeited an additional $44 billion during the temporary income tax hike, which, by the way, was supposed to continue to drop. We then had the rug pulled out from under us when the legislature permanently increased the state income tax by 32%, and we've now paid an additional $10 billion as a result of that tax hike in just the last few years. Yet some politicians are asking you to believe that this time, with this tax hike, unlike in 2011 and unlike 2017, things will be different. Now, despite our state's many fiscal troubles and woes, our flat state income tax serves as practically the only bright spot on the Illinois tax horizon. The Nonpartisan Tax Foundation has noted that, quote, Illinois' low single-rate individual income tax is the saving grace of an otherwise uncompetitive state tax code. And just to give you an idea of state taxes by the numbers, 9 states have no income tax, 9 states have a flat tax, meaning that more than a third of all the states have either a flat state income tax or none at all. And as I say, we are the 6th most populous state. What about the 5 states that are larger than us? 2 have no income tax, and Pennsylvania has a flat tax. And recently, the trend across the nation has been to shift away from progressive taxation. In 2011, Utah switched to a flat tax. In 2014, North Carolina followed suit. And most recently, our neighbor Kentucky did likewise in 2018. Multiple times, it's not working, and it's come up a cropper. Now, I needed to look up what that meant, but apparently it's a colloquial phrase meaning a massive failure. So I know my time's about to expire, so I'd leave you with this. As the editorial board of the Belleville News Democrat stated when this was being debated in the legislature, quote, why in the world would state lawmakers be talking about a progressive tax if it were not a path to more of your money? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Andrew. I appreciate it. We will now bring up Ted to go ahead and give his presentation. I believe you have some slides too, correct? Okay. You're all set here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for having us. I'm Ted Dabrowski with WirePoints, and it's a pleasure to be here with this group and all of you to talk about an extremely important subject. I think this is a really defining moment, and I know we say that in most election cycles and all that, but the people of Illinois have a big choice about whether to allow a progressive tax structure to exist in Illinois or not. And I hope to educate some today about where Illinois is, what's happening, and why this, what are the pros and cons of this tax. WirePoints is a news aggregation, research, and policy group. And our real mission is to make Illinois a destination state, the destination state that it should be. Andrew mentioned some of the great assets that this state has. And if you go back to the 20s through the 60s of 1900s, everybody from across the world was coming to Illinois and to Chicago, right? You had the Europeans coming, you had the Great Migration. Illinois and Chicago was maybe the place to be. Today, it's the exact opposite. And I hope to share with you some of those facts as to what's happening. And I think one thing we have to do is be very careful to talk about taxes by themselves. This is not a tax issue alone. This is about the future of Illinois, so let me get started here. A clear fact is that no state is shrinking like Illinois is. We have shrunk our population by 170,000 since 2010. We have lined up on this graphic all 50 states. And if there's one state that sticks out like a sore thumb, it is Illinois, right? We're competing with West Virginia and others. Is this a tax issue? Do we not tax enough in Illinois? I would argue that higher taxes will make this worse. And you can see some zero tax states in yellow, Texas, Florida. Look at their growth rate. They're not suffering. They have a zero tax system. Lining up the 50 states, it's not as if Illinoisans don't pay enough taxes. Mentioned earlier was that we have the highest property taxes in the country, by far. And that has a lot to do with all the other things that are wrong with Illinois, like the cost of the unions, like too many units of government, collective bargaining laws that are very unfavorable to the taxpayers. There's a lot more that needs to be discussed before taxes. There's a lot of things that need to be fixed before we should even be discussing taxes. And you can see how much lower the rates are. In blue are our neighboring states. It's a lot cheaper to own a home in our neighboring states. It's not just the property taxes. When you combine all state and local taxes, we are the fifth highest in the country, fifth highest in the country. Look at our neighboring states, much lower. It's why people are just going right over the border. And I will broaden this beyond taxes, but the taxes are already too high in Illinois. That has to be something that's understood by the population. Kiplinger, right, the Standard Finance Company, they did a 50-state ranking. They called Illinois the nation's least tax-friendly state in the country. WalletHub, another finance company, calculates, and they have different calculations. One of them puts us at the highest effective tax rate when you take state and local taxes into account. There's not room for Illinois to pay more taxes. And Chicago's own Federal Reserve has done a long-term study back into the 60s of where Illinois ranks against the rest of the country. And we're typically right around the top 10 in the country for total state and local taxation. So there's a wealth of evidence that says we are already overtaxed and people are leaving. And that has a huge impact when you move to housing. Probably the least talked about right now is what's happening to our housing prices in Illinois. People's nest eggs are being destroyed in Illinois. With people leaving, that puts a downward pressure on home values. With property taxes so high, it puts a downward pressure on home values. With overall taxes being so high, it puts a downward pressure on property values. This is another reason why people will start to flee even more. Higher taxes will only make this worse. And of course, what's been mentioned already, we lead the country in corruption. I can only say that more money in the hands, in the coffers of the politicians allow them to do more of the damage that we've seen on the previous slides. These problems that we've shown on the slides, we have the greatest assets in the country, right, with our public infrastructure, national infrastructure, with our universities, with the lake, with the workforce. We have great, great assets. And yet, all those numbers that I showed you before, were last virtually in most things in the country, has been politically done. It's not because we don't pay enough taxes. Talking about the taxes, then. These are the two numbers that I've got circled here in the proposed tax hike if the progressive tax structure passes. 4.9, 495. Not that different from what we're paying, what most people in the middle class are paying today. They say that that those rates will stay like that if the progressive tax is passed. And that raises $3.6 billion, which Governor Pritzker has said is needed to fund some of the deficits. Not for other things, but just the deficits. But the problem is that if anybody's following Illinois, $3.6 billion is not the problem, right? We have lots of additional structural deficits, in particular what COVID might create. We have unpaid bills, 6, 7, the number gets really big. We have to start paying those off. If we pay them $1 billion at a time for the next few years, maybe we can have a chance of paying them off. Whoops. We have actual pension costs. Today, we don't pay anything near what we're supposed to pay for pension costs. And that's why places like Chicago and pensions all over the state are starting to go broke. They're out of money. It's just that they're public entities, so they don't have to file bankruptcy. But if they were private, they would have been bankrupt a long time ago. So when you add all that up, that's just that. Then $10 billion is what Pritzker maybe should be asking for in tax hikes. And if you do the rates for that, calculate the rates based on the current, I like Dan laughing there. The rates go to 8.5% to 9%. It's funny that Dan laughs, but they were just talking about the need for more education funding. $7 billion, is that the number you said, Ralph? $7 billion. They want more money for higher ed. They want a property tax relief. Well, if you add that stuff to it, so instead of 8.5% and 9% for the middle class and much higher for the rich, right? Add the $5 billion or $7 billion that Ralph is proposing. It's got to come from somewhere. Add more for higher ed. Add more for property tax relief. If you do that, they need $15 billion. And the problem is they won't commit to a number, so we don't know what the real rates will be. If that's the case, the rates on the middle class start to double. And this is simple math. You grab the taxes paid, calculate how much is needed, and you just calculate the rates. Now, just another important point. Let's look at our neighbors. You have flat tax Michigan at 4.25. You have flat tax Indiana at 3.23. You have flat tax Kentucky, who just switched away from a progressive tax in 2018, is now a flat tax state. Let me say that right. They switched from a progressive tax to a flat tax in 2018, 5%. Missouri, its highest tax rate on its highest income level is 5.4% on just over $8,000. So basically, everybody that makes $8,000 and above has effectively the same rate. So again, this is the reality that we have to compete with. Now, we've heard a lot of stuff about, we need to take care of making the income tax rate progressive. But it's the same politicians who have passed gas taxes, cigarette taxes, vehicle registration taxes, real estate transfer taxes, gambling taxes. Every one of those is regressive. And they've raised the heck out of them in the last couple of years. So that's a big problem to begin with. We need to see some consistency in language here. And let me end with kind of a broad point. This is a really difficult time. If you look around the world, it's a crazy time. Nobody is talking about hiking taxes. It's really, go look around, go Google it and see who you can find, this having a serious discussion on taxes. It's all about making government more effective given the difficulty we're in. We have the COVID crisis. We have the economic crisis as a result of the shutdowns. We have the riots and the protests that are affecting downtown. So we have to be really careful in Illinois about our policies. We have to be really smart, and we have to take the whole thing into account. We can't assume that this is just a simple tax discussion, because if it's not, if it was just taxes, maybe people would understand. But when you add the corruption, the home value collapse, the pension cost, the labor cost, it's too much. 2 more slides. This one is what really fears me. Red means it's shrunk since 2010. The counties have shrunk since 2010. Green means they've grown. 93 out of 102 counties in Illinois have shrunk. Scary stuff. You won't see this in other states, maybe West Virginia. And the last slide, it's not just Illinois leaving, right? The red is residents who left over the past 15 years. It's also fewer coming in. And when you add up, I'm not going to that state with I'm getting out of here, and you've got a real toxic situation. So there's a lot more to be said here. Now, thank you for your time, and this is the opening. I will move on from there.
I want to thank all of our speakers. A note came in from somebody saying, please speak closer to the microphone because with the streaming, it's hard to hear. So I will try to do that. As you can see, this is a very contentious issue. It's something that we really need to do a lot of research on, all of us, regardless of whether you're pro or con, and this has been extremely informative. So I'm going to go ahead now with some of the questions that have come in. If anybody else out there has questions, you have to do it on the website, and I have a little iPad here that the questions pop up on. And I will open these up to everybody to answer. And the first question that we have is, Illinois passed a massive income tax increase twice before, and they were supposed to fix Illinois' problems but failed. Why should Illinoisans believe lawmakers this time? Daniel?
Yeah, I'll take that as someone who very proudly, in the middle of a race for governor, voted for the 2017 income tax hike. I certainly wouldn't be able to look at myself in the mirror if I hadn't done that. The state needed that. By the way, it was a little astonishing to hear someone refer, I believe it was Andrew, to the notion that that was done in secret over the July 4th holiday because the Illinois taxpayers apparently aren't smart enough to both enjoy a parade and notice what their legislators are doing to them. Actually, the reality was the opposite. The reason that passed was because of enormous public pressure on Republicans to break with Governor Rauner and finally end the budget stalemate. And it was 10 brave Republicans who were willing to do that and save the state of Illinois. I was proud to join them at some political cost to myself as well, I suspect. Now, those tax hikes did exactly what they were supposed to do, which is bring in a bunch of additional money for the state of Illinois. What they didn't do was fix the whole problem. And I think that you noticed my reaction. I couldn't stop myself from laughing out loud at Ted's slide when he showed those incredibly high tax rates. I wasn't laughing at that slide because it's kind of preposterous to put words in the mouth of people who would never support a policy like that and pretend that they would. I laughed because the specific claim made by the other side is, look, we cannot solve this whole problem with taxes alone. And then, when a proposal is made to solve only some of the problem with taxes alone, the response is, whoa, 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 how dare you guys, you're not solving the whole problem. Well, I think most people in Illinois want the legislators and the governor to come together and find solutions that are broad-based, that are shared sacrifice, that ask people to pay more, but also find efficiencies in government. And so I think it is a strength of both this proposal and the ones that were enacted in the past that said, listen, we've got a big fiscal problem. We've got to find some more money, but we're not going to pretend to solve this whole problem with taxes alone. J.B. Pritzker doesn't pretend he can solve this whole problem with taxes alone. Democratic legislators don't pretend we can solve this whole problem with taxes alone. I don't pretend we can solve this whole problem with taxes alone. And frankly, I don't think we should try to do that. Instead, we take bites one at a time, doing difficult, painful things in different areas of government. This is frankly a common sense thing that puts us in line with most states, and we ought to do it.
Yes.
Just
Ted, you should be
testing
on.
1, 2, 3. There it is. The question was, something about the previous tax hikes, and those tax hikes were massive. The 2011 temporary tax was a 67% increase in taxation. And as Andrew said, it collected some nearly $40 billion in additional taxes. And it was supposed to fix the problems. I urge all of you who are out there, go look on the internet and go look and see what our politicians said. They said it would solve Illinois' problems, finally. And it would solve most, like unpaid bills, pensions, everything. A few years after that, things were actually worse. Why? Because when you fill the government coffers with more cash and they haven't reformed anything, well, they lose any impetus, any pressure to reform. They spend it. And so what happened was then we needed a second, a permanent tax hike is what they said we needed. And again, it was more money. Go look again. They will say, we finally have a balanced budget. Just look at the quotes. We finally solved the problems. Not at all. It's gotten even worse. And I'm talking about pre-pandemic. What's fascinating to me is what Dan says about, we just need to do the tax hike. I have yet look around, has any politician talked about big reforms first? Do the hard ones first. Do the ones that are much harder, the ones that are the real ones, the sustainable ones. That's what we should do first, and then let them come back and talk about taxes. But when Dan Biss and Ralph Martiri talk about pension reform and how to lower this 3% compounded COLA that just makes pensions huge, when we continue to spend more on free retiree health care for government workers, when we continue to have the most units of government with these massive pensions and massive costs for the bureaucrats that run them, that has
Passed. I don't recall any elected officials saying that it solves all the problems, but I did hear them say it solves some of the problems. Maybe some of them did. Go to our website. We never said it solved all the problems, number one. Number two, the accumulated deficit in the general fund the day that passed was $16 billion. The day the tax phased out, as they said it would, when Governor Rauner came into office in 2014, that accumulated deficit had been paid down to just under 5. They used every penny of that tax increase to pay down the deficit and pay the growing cost of the pension ramp that I showed you. Then the tax phased down, and it wasn't replaced with new revenue. So it went from 5% down to 3.75%, and the deficit ballooned again because of the lack of revenue. And it ballooned under Governor Rauner to the point where it got back up to the $12, $13 billion range when Dan and his peers worked with the Republican Party and said, we need the revenue. So to say the revenue wasn't used to pay down the debt or wasn't effective is just not accurate. It just doesn't comport with any of the facts. Number two, as far as future expenditure needs, no one is saying that this fair tax proposal solves all our problems. The governor doesn't say that. No one who voted for it says that. We don't say that. It's one of 3 or 4 really needed reforms the state has to do fiscally, because if our income tax isn't designed to comport with ability to pay, and you saw the differential in growth in income over time spread across our state. If our rate structure can't respond to that, we will continue to have structural deficits, and that will continue to pressure a political system to push costs down to your property taxes and to borrow to spend rather than to tax and spend. And that's utterly irresponsible. That's what got us in this mess, was ignoring how tax policy is supposed to work.
Thank you, Ralph. I got time
I
now
have a lot
here.
more, but I'm going to stop it there.
I'm sure, but people can ask questions
With all
afterwards.
numbers you can vet.
And I know Andrew wanted to say something, and then I think what I'm going to do, so that I can get through all of the questions, is let you each decide who wants to speak for your pro or con, so that we don't have 4 people, okay? Go ahead, Andrew.
Thank you. Simply remind everyone that one of the fundamental predicates of the proponents' writ large argument is this notion that 97% of people will pay the same or less under the graduated income tax scheme. And the only reason they can say that is because politicians broke their promise that they had made to the taxpayers when they permanently increase the income tax, meaning politicians had to raise your taxes in order to pretend to lower them. And so, as we've heard here now, the proponents say that these introductory rates are insufficient, will need to increase, and in fact, Professor Martiri's organization has
I absolutely
promoted...
did not say that, so do not put words in mine or Dan's mouth. Neither of us believe those rates need to increase. I want to be very clear about that.
Well, I would...
And so don't put words in my mouth,
That's
and I
fair.
promise you I won't put words in yours.
Thank you. I thank you. I would mention that the CT...
They can't hear you.
What we need in total new revenue is probably around $4.5 to $5 billion. And this, in a good economy post-COVID, raises 3.6. The rest of that revenue would come from a minor expansion of the sales tax base to include consumer services only, And then the rest of our fiscal relief would come from a rational reamortization of the debt owed to the pension system. If we did all those things, we could eliminate our structural deficit literally within 3 to 5 years. We could adequately fund education from the state. We could drive down property taxes, and that would be important. Here's a graphic that shows business tax burden from Ernst & Young in the state of Illinois. This is business taxes paid as property taxes. By far and away, the biggest portion of business tax burden is the property tax. Here's the corporate income tax. Here's the individual income taxes small business owners, S corporation, LLC, partnership owners pay as a flow-through on their profits. You mean to tell me shifting some tax burden away from a fixed cost, a business has to pay whether or not it's profitable, to a variable cost that's only paid by a business when it is in fact profitable is bad for business? Because that's exactly what the graduated rate structure does. Is one of the most pro-business tax proposals ever seen, and proof of that is in the economic data nationally. So you correctly said 9 states have no income taxes, and these include the states all the non-tax people claim are the miracle states: Texas, Florida, Nevada, North Dakota. 9 states in America that have the highest tax rates, the highest rates on their income taxes, compared to those 9 states with no tax. Over the last decade, Bureau of Economic Analysis
sorry,
data,
I'm going to
let me
have to
just
cut
say,
you off.
State GDP growth, 9.5% in the high tax states, only 2% in the no tax states. Personal income growth higher in the high tax states, consumption higher in the high tax states.
Thanks,
There
Ralph.
has never been a statistically meaningful correlation between tax policy and economic growth at the state level. Never.
Thank you. Who's going to take this? Ted?
Yes, if you watch a lot of the debates that have gone on over the past year or so, lots of government, and that means lots of salaries, lots of pensions, lots of unions. It gets expensive. We should not have the most units of government by far. If you look at California, Florida, they have far fewer units, and they're smaller. So we need kind of reforms on that. When you talk about reforms to collective bargaining laws, if you look at the right to strike, this is why CPS keeps striking. Illinois is the only state of our neighboring states that allows teachers to strike. The unions have too much power, and the ordinary residents don't have that kind of power. They have to keep paying these higher and higher property taxes. So the power is all misaligned in Illinois. The ordinary resident doesn't have the power, and the government infrastructure does, and that's why they keep asking for more and more money, and that's why the numbers ever end. What we need to do is do things like pension reform, collective bargaining reform, reduce the units of local government, remove free retiree health care for state workers. Those are the kind of things we need to work on to make things fair first for ordinary Illinoisans. Then we can have a discussion about tax hikes.
Thank you, Ted. I will ask, as the moderator, that we try to stick to the question. I know there's a lot of other issues that come in on both sides that are out there that are part of this whole conversation, but I think it's important that we try to answer the specific question rather than get ourselves into the weeds and the mud on some of the other things that are peripheral. So the next question here is, if a progressive tax is so important, why did Illinois just hike the gas tax, the cigarette tax, the vehicle fees, and expand gambling, which hurt the poor the most? Daniel?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I was sort of astonished to hear Ted make that point because it is the best argument on our side of this debate. Ralph said this: the tools that the state has to bring in revenue today are, without exception, regressive. It doesn't matter what you want, what you believe, what your values are, what your preferences are. It doesn't make a damn bit of difference. If you are looking for new revenue under the current Constitution, you have to stick it to the middle class and the poor. It's your only legal option. And so, when Governor Pritzker came into office, having promised during the campaign to do a massive capital infrastructure program, which in my opinion the state needed, the only tools at his disposal to pay for it were these awful regressive taxes. The one option the one way for the state to bring in revenue that doesn't go after the poor, middle class, working families, and small businesses. The only option is a fair tax, and what's on the ballot this November is giving the state the ability to consider that option. And so, you know, I just want to back up a tiny bit, if you, with your indulgence, Amanda. There is a lot of talk about other issues and different fights, and I do think those are really important fights, but I think they're not really germane right now. We can talk about all those reforms forever, and I've advocated for some of them and fought hard for some of them. But right now, the state's revenue needs are the state's revenue needs. And if we can't get the money we need through a fair tax, the only options that are going to be left to Governor Pritzker and the legislature are the worst options. Do we want to vote no and force them to raise more regressive taxes? No, we don't want to do that. We want to vote yes, so at least there's a chance to have a tax that doesn't again go after the same people who really can't afford to pay more.
Thanks, Daniel. The next question is,
May we respond?
oh, did you want to respond?
Sure.
Sure, all right.
So of course, we know the problems that the state faces with the highest combined state and local tax burden. We have the highest wireless tax, we have among the highest property taxes, the third highest gasoline tax, and now we have this graduate income tax proposal, which purports to raise $3.4 billion in new revenue, but I've heard some proponents suggest that now because of the pandemic, it may be less.
I don't want to cut you off, but the question is about expanding gambling and gas tax and, okay.
Right, yeah. So, you know, to the idea that, you know, I've not heard anybody suggesting that if this passes, other taxes will go down. And again,
What?
taxes, so would you support decreasing the gasoline tax if the state gets $3.4 billion in more revenue?
I would very strongly support using new revenue to shift to a better school funding system that will allow property taxes
But can
to go down.
$3.4 billion do it?
Not all of it, but it's a step. It's
Okay.
absolutely a step.
Thank
It's
you.
a critical step.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I yield the floor.
Okay, next question. North Carolina went to a flat tax, and I know you both talked about that. Went to a flat tax in 2014. Kentucky went to a flat tax in 2018. Isn't the trend toward flat taxes?
Let me say this. Andrew and his kind of political movement have been very successful. They had tremendous success in electing far right-wing, kind of fringe of the Republican Party leaders in various states. One such state is Kansas, a state that was set up to be the experiment of the Americans for Prosperity style of tax philosophy. With Governor Brownback and a compliant legislature, they purged moderate Republicans from the party and had completely unified Americans for Prosperity style government. And they destroyed the state. They drove it into the sea, so much that the Republican Party has come back and really changed their point of view on these basic questions about the balance that's needed to have a successful economy. So yeah, there were some political successes on the part of the other side, but the evidence from those cases is because they were allowed to under their Constitution. Their Constitution said that people can run for governor and state representative and state senator and say whether they want a flat tax or not, and then once they've won based on campaigning on their values, they can go and do it. I wouldn't campaign on doing that, but the folks who ran in North Carolina and Kentucky did, and they won and they get to enact their agenda. What we're saying is, let's let the people of Illinois vote for candidates who agree with them on these questions and then enact those policies instead of holding our hands behind our backs. I'll end by saying, yes, Kentucky did make that change, but you know what states didn't? How about Wisconsin? How about the state closest to us? How about the state that had a governor who was supposed to be the national hero on conservative fiscal policy, Scott Walker, who served as governor for 8 years and didn't even propose going to a
Thanks,
flat
Daniel.
tax?
I'm at the end here. I'm sorry.
No problem. I'm done too.
Hate to cut people off. And my other side, Ted? No, you want Andrew to speak.
Sure. As to the Kansas notion, this is one of the red herrings of the opponents of the flat tax. When Kansas implemented their income tax cuts, What they failed to do was budget accordingly, so they didn't implement any reforms or spending cuts, the things precisely the things that Mr. Dabrowski and I are suggesting. There was also a flaw in the Kansas reform that incentivized tax avoidance because of a poorly structured exemption for pass-through entities. And so, we can talk about that. But the model really is North Carolina. After they switched to a flat tax, the North Carolina economy began doing extraordinarily well and outperforming the national economy, and to the point of Wisconsin, under the legislature and Governor Walker, they actually decreased rates across the board and eliminated one of the brackets of their graduated income tax.
Okay, my next question. How many states allow a graduated income tax? That doesn't mean they have it, but they allow it. And how many states actually use a graduated income tax?
I'm pretty sure it's 34 or 35
You
allow
want to take
it.
your mask
Oh,
down so people can hear
forgot it
you?
was on. 34 or 35 allow it, and 32 have it.
Okay.
Just to add some flavor to that, it's important to understand that the progressive there's different kinds of progressive taxes. Some that have really, really high rates on the wealthy. Take California, take Hawaii. California's highest rate is 13.3% on millionaires. Hawaii is 11% at a pretty high level. But there's other progressive tax states, and these are the ones that Ralph and Dan aren't proposing these. If you look at Georgia, Georgia's highest rate is 5.75% on all incomes above $7,000. So it's really a flat tax rate. Oh, here it is on the screen there. Illinois has a 495 flat tax today. Missouri's progressive tax is 5.4%, is the highest rate on $8,400. Now, again, if you look at the numbers that the proponents of the progressive tax are proposing, it's nothing like that. They want really high rates on wealthy, and eventually, we argue, as spending goes up for all their priorities, then the rates on middle class will go higher. Look at New Mexico, 4.9% on incomes above $16,000. That's it. These are flat taxes. They're effectively flat tax states.
How many states have a flat tax? If 32 are using a graduated, no?
32 have a graduate.
32 have a graduated or are using a graduated?
Correct. And then you have 8 zero tax states, and you have, 9 flat tax states.
And just for the panel to clarify for anybody who's watching out there, calling it a progressive tax or calling it a graduated tax are the same thing?
Yeah.
Good, because we're using two different words. I
Yeah,
don't
it
want
just
to
means a
confuse.
graduated rate structure with higher marginal rates on
All
higher
right.
levels of income and lower marginal rates. on
Next
lower.
question. Doesn't the new amendment allow a simple majority to change the tax rates? So really, the rate for everyone can be whatever the majority wants it to be.
The short answer is yes, and it's not the amendment, it's the statute. In fact, there were folks in the legislature that suggested a constitutional amendment to require a supermajority to raise taxes, and you can imagine where that proposal went. But yes, it would remain the case that at any time with a simple majority, the legislature could add brackets, increase rates, and reduce the thresholds at which higher rates apply. And it's also worth noting that the original amendment stated that there shall be one tax on income. And it also had a line prohibiting local income taxes. That prohibition against local income taxes was struck from the amendment that the legislature passed, and the legislature also replaced one tax with any tax, meaning they could have one rate schedule as proposed for regular individual income, and they could have a separate rate schedule to tax retirement income, for instance. And so there is a concern that this does make it easier for Illinois to tax retirement income. Of course, we're one of only a few states that exempts it. And so there are very, very concerning details about the amendment itself, which of course will not appear on the ballot. On the ballot will be a, quote, explanation of the amendment, which was written by the proponents, but, I guess, all's fair, winner take all. And so, yes, a simple majority will be able to add brackets, increase rates, and reduce the thresholds at which higher rates apply at any time. And the amendment also makes it easier to begin taxing retirement income.
Thank you.
Okay, so, yeah, so the amendment doesn't change law, in other words. That's what they could do now. There's no change in law on that, so they could adjust the rate anytime they want. Number two, it doesn't make it easier to tax retirement income, and in fact, there is no effort to tax retirement income, and Governor Pritzker specifically said he would veto any tax on retirement income. There's no support for that in the state of Illinois. We're one of only 3 states that exempts all retirement income from taxation. Finally, we looked at all the states that have a graduated rate structure over the last 25 years to see whether or not they jury-rigged those structures to increase taxes on the middle class after promising not to. 80% of them made no change. 15% of them passed broad across-the-board tax cuts. 5% of them passed broad across-the-board tax increases. 2% of them passed tax increases that only applied to the wealthiest in their state. Meaning, if you have a graduated rate structure and your answer is no, this is a pretty clear fix to have our tax system respond to how income growth is distributed in the modern economy. It's needed or we'll never eliminate that structural deficit. It's not the only thing they need to do, and the other things they need to do involve some rational dealing with the pension ramp and a minor expansion of the sales tax base. And those things clear up all the state's fiscal problems. And they keep talking about our state being such a high-tax state because one thing they're leaving out is fees. So go to the website of the Federation of Tax Administrators. They don't do any modeling. They just report to you the actual data. They don't have a model, something where they play with the numbers.
Thank you.
Yet
I'm
based on
out
their
of time
numbers,
here.
our total tax and fee burden as a percentage of income ranks 27th in the nation. We have the 6th largest population and 5th largest economy.
Okay.
For all the taxes. Let's do this tax but lower others. It's always a cumulative. So this is what opens the door. And if you look, you saw the statistics we put about where we stand on taxes. This opens up the door to more. If you are a 65-year-old retiree and you've got the highest property taxes in the nation, and then you add an income tax to that on your retirement income, you can expect the numbers to continue to flood out of Illinois as people leave.
So the question was, does this constitutional amendment open the door to taxing retirement income? And the answer is no. And it's unequivocally no, and it's simply no. And so I think the extent of blatant misinformation coming at you from Ted is really indicative of the conversation.
Please explain why it's no.
And I was just about to. Thank you for the question. The great majority of the fear-mongering coming from opponents of this amendment goes like this. They say, hey, I know the proposal in front of you sounds good, but just wait. They're going to do this nice-sounding thing now, then they're going to come back and do this other mean-sounding thing later. Which is a fine thing to say, except all of the mean-sounding things that they want us to be scared about what the politicians might do later are things they could already do today. They could tax retirement income today. They could raise middle-class income taxes today. They could do literally every single thing that Ted is telling you we ought to be scared about today. What they can't do today is institute a fair tax and ask the wealthy to pay their share so we can stop going after the poor, so we can stop going after working families, so we can stop going after the middle class, so we can stop going after small businesses. This is an amendment that allows them to do the right thing. It doesn't guarantee that they'll do the right thing, and I've lived in Illinois long enough to know they may well not do the right thing, but right now they couldn't even do the right thing if they wanted to. Giving them the chance is better than continuing to prohibit them from doing it.
Thank you. Okay, I know we're close on time. Claire, one of the things that we're going to do, and I appreciate the panel, and I've got more questions, is if we don't continue live streaming, we can still continue to go through these questions for our website, and it's recorded so that your answers can get on, on the website so that people can still look at it. It's just, I think we're restricted in the time that we can live stream. And the place to see these for everybody is www.lzacc.com and look for the little tag to click on the graduated income tax session. So we'll do our best to answer the rest of these questions. A few more have come in that are interesting, but I think we're done with the live session, correct? Okay, so I'll go